Hi everyone, I'm Jennie with Infinity Real Estate, and today I'm continuing my series on active and vibrant retirement in Gig Harbor and all things Gig Harbor. I know I've said this a million times, but we really do live in one of the most beautiful places in the world. The Puget Sound is like second to none. We have water, we have 2 mountain ranges, we have trees, we have it all. But one of the things that we have in Greater Gig Harbor that is different from many places is we have more than 100 miles of Puget Sound shoreline. With that being the case, it makes sense that if you want to move here, you might have a dream of living in one of these amazing waterfront properties. Who wouldn't? I live on the water myself. With that being said, I have learned a lot in the 9 years that I've been a waterfront property owner. It's not exactly all it's cracked up to be. There are considerations that are important and often overlooked. So I thought, why not do a video on it? I'm here to tell you that living on the water is amazing and I wouldn't trade it, but there are overlooked considerations. I've grouped them into 6 categories, and I'm just gonna skim the surface of each one because remember, I am a real estate broker. I am no means an expert in some of these waterfront considerations, but I do want you to know about them, and then I'm gonna help you, point you to the resources where you can find more information about them. The first consideration we're gonna talk about is the tides. Why would we be talking about that? Well, the Puget Sound saltwater tides are very different than what you're probably used to compared to an ocean tide. Most people have visited an ocean, walked along the beach, and maybe they've seen the tide out a little further on the beach, and then it comes in and you might have a little water splashing on your feet. Most people think that's what tides are. Here in the Puget Sound, it's very different. Our tides rise and fall dramatically twice each day in terms of depth. I call it a tide swing, and that means how low the tide can go versus how high the tide can go. And on an average daily basis, that is 12 feet or more. Why is that? Well, the Puget Sound is so much smaller as a body, and so when the ocean currents and the tides come into the Puget Sound, it's like funneling a whole ton of water into a bathtub, and it has no choice but to rise. And then when it goes out, it falls just as dramatically. A lot of people are really surprised when we go to a waterfront property and it looks very different than perhaps it looked in the marketing photos because it might be at low tide. Where we are right now, we are at a pretty high tide, and you can see that the water is actually splashing up against the boat ramp. At a low tide, we would have rock going out for probably more than 100 feet. The tides have a pretty dramatic impact on your property for a number of reasons. One is just the look and feel. Something looks one way at a high tide and it looks very different at a low tide, but probably more importantly, it's what can it do to your property in terms of maintenance and damage. On a day-to-day basis and in calm weather, when we have 2 tides that ebb and flow per day, with weather like this, which is actually pretty typical, it's not going to do too much damage, or we have to worry too much damage about the bulkheads or the shorelines. But particularly as we get further into the fall and the winter and our storms get more dramatic, the tides also rise in the winter. Each winter we have what's called king tides, and this is where the sun, the moon, and the earth line up just perfectly to cause an extremely high tide. When I say a normal tide can be about 12 feet, and that's what this is right now, a king tide can be more than 15 feet. And that, coupled with a storm and a low pressure system, can cause a whole bunch of damage. We had a really bad king tide event that came out of nowhere in the winter of 2022. Downtown Gig Harbor, all the parks, the docks, even the Net Shed restaurant had a foot of water in it, and it just came out of nowhere. Hour or so later, all that water dissipated, but unfortunately, those areas where the water went in, there was a lot of damage that was done to structures. And that's an important consideration if you live on the water. Another thing about the force of the tides, as I was talking about a minute ago, is Because the tides are so strong here and they go up and down so dramatically, they do have a hydrostatic pressure effect on things like bulkheads and all of the marine environment below it. The majority of the homes in and around Gig Harbor are sat up pretty far from the actual water line, but there are low-lying areas where the dwellings are closer, and in those circumstances, the homeowners are required to have flood insurance if they're going to have any kind of financing on the property. Because the risk of tidal flooding is relatively low compared to the kind of flood risks that are evident in other parts of the country, our flood insurance is by and large affordable compared to other places. But just like any kind of insurance policy, you need to understand what is actually covered and what's not. I actually had one of my clients share with me that the policy that he had, a certain tidal event was actually not covered, and therefore there wasn't coverage when there was water damage to the house. So you just need to know, and it's one of the considerations about owning waterfront property you need to be aware of. From a recreation standpoint, you have to be very aware of where the tides are and what's going on with the tides. You may or may not be able to launch a kayak or a canoe at the time you want, because if the tide's out, you might not be able to get to it. I live on Raft Island, and for example, when the tide is high, like right now, there's going to be 12 feet or more of water above our bridge, and you can drive any kind of boat under it. However, when the tide is at a 0 or below, there's no water whatsoever. You have to know what you're doing and be careful not to get stranded in too low of a tide. Otherwise, you're going to be sitting there looking pretty stupid while everybody's laughing at you and waiting for the tide to come up so that you can keep going. Another thing about the tides is the currents. You know, we talked about the ocean before, and the ocean has surf and torrential waves and all that kind of stuff, which, as you can see, we do not have here, which is incredible. However, the volume of the tides, like I was talking about a minute ago, creates some very, very funky currents in certain locations. The area of the Tacoma Narrows, under the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, is actually pretty famous for having just rip-roaring currents. So again, some areas super calm all the time. You don't have to worry about it. Some areas might look calm, but you might have to be really careful what you're doing. The next big thing we have to talk about is shoreline construction and permitting. I mentioned what kind of havoc the tides can wreak on your bulkheads, but what happens when you have to get something like a bulkhead fixed? Or even more importantly, it's everybody's dream when they see this beautiful, beautiful scenery to want to build a waterfront home or a waterfront cabin somewhere along the shoreline. Well, I'm here to tell you that the permitting process to do anything at all within a shoreline jurisdiction is essentially an act of God. It's not impossible, but you just have to be prepared for the challenges that you're going to have. One of the things that surprises people the most when I talk about permitting to do anything along the shoreline is time. If you come from other places where getting a permit to do things is relatively easy, you might think you can get a permit in weeks or months to do something. Well, not here. We're talking years, and we're talking multiple years in order to repair or replace or build anything within 200 feet of the shoreline. That is what's considered the shoreline jurisdiction. Any area within 200 feet of the shoreline, you have to get permission, which takes a very long time and involves a whole lot of studies from probably a half dozen different entities. Each of these entities are involved because this whole ecosystem is very, very critical, and it's very important, not just to the health of the Puget Sound itself and to all of the plants and the marine life that are here, but the Puget Sound goes out into the open ocean, and therefore everything matters, and that's why everyone has to be involved. Depending on where you are, if you're in the city of Gig Harbor or unincorporated Pierce County, which is what most of our shoreline is, you're going to start with that Pierce County building department or the city of Gig Harbor. Just within the building department, you're going to have to deal with health and drinking water, which involves septic systems, stormwater runoff, and also fire and emergency management. Then we get into all of the entities that have a very important interest on what happens in and around the water. We're talking about the Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Department of Ecology, which can be Washington State, and then sometimes federal agencies get involved in that, the Department of Natural Resources, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Native American tribes that were original to this area. I know that might sound crazy, but yes, every single one of these entities has a say in what can be done. I also have news for you. This is not a drop in the bucket from a financial standpoint. It's pretty darn expensive, both in the permitting process, then in terms of being able to get something done. If you buy a property that has an existing structure, for example, a bulkhead in place or a dock that's already in place, or even a cabin that's real close to the waterfront, you are more likely to get permits and a little bit faster to have those structures repaired, or if it's a house, you might be able to expand a little bit on that footprint versus getting a permit for a brand new structure. And one other caveat to all of this, so you wait for years in the permitting process and then you finally get your permit, and guess what? Work on the shoreline, right directly on the shoreline, can only be done for half the year because anytime fish are migrating, there's no work allowed on the water. So from mid-July to mid-February, you can have work done. After that, good luck until next year. I could give you loads of examples, but I have one personal story that really speaks to how this process works. And I promise you, my story is no different than just about anybody else's. The property that we're on right now has some challenges with the bulkhead, and they've been years in the permitting process, and they're just hoping they get it soon. At my house, we knew when we purchased that our bulkhead was going to be needing to be replaced at some point. We started the process in 2019 to replace our failing bulkhead. And at that time, it was sort of like, okay, here's a quote. By the way, it was for about 75 feet, and the quote was about $60,000. This was in 2019. We hired a permitting consultant to help us through the process. I'm going to touch on that again in a minute. And off we go. Guess when we actually got our building permit to do our new bulkhead? About 3 months ago. In 2025, we finally got our bulkhead permit, and guess what happened to the price? It more than doubled. So we just paid $125,000 to have 75 feet of our bulkhead replaced. And that doesn't count all of the permitting fees because, as I mentioned, none of these entities are a cheap date. And so I think we spent about $25,000 in permitting fees and then $125,000 and 6 years to get our bulkhead replaced. Any kind of permitting process on the shoreline is extremely complex. And even though it took 6 years for us, there's no way we could have gotten through it without a permitting consultant. I highly recommend that you don't try to get some kind of shoreline permit on your own. And there are a number of companies right here in Gig Harbor that can provide the expertise you need to walk your project through the permitting process and all of these entities from start to finish. So here we go with number 3, docks. Such a big topic. Everybody wants to talk about docks, and there's so much to talk about, but it does a really nice job following my last bit about shoreline permitting and construction. Of course, you want to move to the Pacific Northwest and you see all of this great property and you say, I want a dock. You know, of course, I want a dock. I should be able to put in a dock. Well, you may be gathered from my previous segment that it's not quite that easy. I wouldn't say that getting a new dock, if you don't already have one, is impossible. It is in some circumstances, I'll tell you about in a minute. I would just say maybe more like optimistic. And once again, I would say buckle up, Buttercup, because you're in for a long, expensive ride. A dock is one place where an existing structure has a whole lot of value to you. Because if you have an existing structure that is essentially grandfathered, it is a whole lot easier to get a permit to repair it or even mostly replace it. But it's 1,000% easier than trying to start from scratch. Another thing I'll tell you is a little known caveat until you get into the process If by chance you and your neighbor are willing to go in together and share in a dock, you will actually get somewhat fast-tracked in the process. From start to finish, it's not uncommon for dock permits to take 6 years or more. However, if you're willing to go in with a neighbor, you might be able to get that down to 3. Why? Because they don't want to have as many docks as can be built, and they want people to be willing to go in and share the cost, because it does less damage to the marine environment ultimately. So let's get into cost. There are lots of considerations when it comes to the cost of a dock, but also what kind of dock you can get. Everybody, of course, wants to have a dock that you can just park a big boat at and it's never gonna go dry, but that's just not exactly how it works. Those entities that I told you about before that all get to weigh in on this, they have very strict rules that revolve around how long of a dock you can have, how wide it can be, what kind of structure it needs to be in terms of how much light it's going to let through, how much shade it's going to provide to the plant and the marine life underneath it, and then what kind of plants you have to plant along your actual shoreline in order to further protect the marine environment. None of it is easy, I promise. All of these are very important considerations to note, and when you couple that along with the cost that I'll tell you about in a minute, you might decide ultimately that going down this path is not really something you want to do. You can go through this entire process, although you'll know in advance that you're unlikely in most places within Gig Harbor to be able to get a dock where your boat is not going to go dry at low tide. The reality of how long of a dock that they will allow you to build in a place like we are now, the length of your dock is based on the distance between us and the water across, and they will only let you go a certain distance into what is called the fetch. None of the docks on this side of the water here are able to be long enough that they always have water underneath them. You're gonna have to put a boat lift in or a number of different things. It's still great to have, but these are important considerations. The other thing that is very important for you to note is that there are a lot of locations that the answer is just a straight up no. There are just a few places in the area where you can have a true deep water dock. Downtown Gig Harbor is definitely the biggest place in our area that has the most number of deep water docks. There are limited areas of Willachet Bay, Horsehead Bay, and also the backside of Raft Island where you can have a deep water dock. These are the places where you can have large boats moored and they don't go dry. So you can imagine with such a limited opportunity why these particular docks are so valuable to a piece of property. A dock of any kind presents tremendous value to a property. Even an existing dock that's not in very good condition, because it's grandfathered to be able to be repaired or ultimately rebuilt, is going to have a lot of value. A deep water dock, a brand new or a really, really nice deep water dock, for example, as real estate brokers, we value those at over $1 million in certain circumstances. A dock, even a dock that goes dry, depending on its location, we might value at almost $500,000. You might ask, why on earth are they valued so high? Well, that's because of the 6+ year process it takes to get the permit. And then, here we go, the cost. In those 6 years, you can expect to pay $100,000 to $150,000 just in the permitting process. I'm not kidding, the permitting process. All of those various entities, they're gonna get you. Then to build your dock is going to be another $100,000 to $200,000, maybe even a little more, depending on the type of dock that you're building. So that's why they're so valuable if they are existing, and you can imagine why people want to have them on their property rather than have to go through the process to start over. So moving on, the next thing we're going to talk about are beaches and banks and the height of the banks. So we have different kind of beaches I'll talk about in a moment, and we have low bank waterfront property where I'm standing now, and then we're going to move on to a high bank property and talk about some of those considerations. So here we are on a high bank waterfront property, and one of the most important benefits of a high bank waterfront property is the view. You get the most spectacular vistas and views when you're high up on the cliffs overlooking the water. From where we are now, if the weather was a little bit better, you would be able to see for days, and it really is nothing short of magical and spectacular. Also, when you're on a high bank waterfront property, you get a little more privacy, more than a little, you get a lot more privacy from anything that's going on the water. If you have kayakers or people paddleboarding by or boats, you don't have the kind of noise, you just have a lot more privacy from that. Even here where we are, I don't know if you can see it, but Cuts Island State Park is in the background. Cuts Island is a mecca for waterfront fun in the summertime. And from this vantage, you can see it, you can just barely hear it in the background, but you can go about doing whatever it is that you want to do and just enjoy it from the distance. Sometimes with high bank waterfront properties, you have access to the water. Sometimes you don't. Some of the banks that we have here, particularly just as you're coming outside of Gig Harbor, those banks can be 200 feet high. And so there's just no way you're going to get a staircase or anything down to the water from there. But in other places, you can get a staircase, like the property that we have here. You're just going to get your exercise as you're going up and down for sure. And you're probably not going to be schlepping your canoes and kayaks down to the water. So if you have a spot to store them down by the water, great. Otherwise, you might be putting them in at a boat launch or something like that. With any kind of waterfront property, this is important, but particularly with high bank and also medium bank, geotechnical considerations are something you have to keep in mind. Naturally, banks slough. And if your bank is going to slough or have a slide, you want to know what you think the chances of that are. There are factors that can increase the risk of slides and sloughs on your bank. And so before you purchase a property, you want to hire a geotechnical engineer to come out and do an evaluation for you and tell you the things that are good about your bank, that you might want to be more considerate of, and even repairs that you might want to make sure that your bank is stable. Where we are now, you see these big old growth trees that are just huge anchors into this bank, and things like that are very important. Also, drainage. Drainage from your house and your property is the most important thing you can do to protect your bank. When you talk to a geotech, they're going to help you make sure that your drainage properly routes all the way down to the bottom so that you don't, or that at least that you are mitigating your risk of having a slide. Also, if you're looking at a property where the house is very close to the top of the bank, you have to decide if that is a risk you want to take on. Most of our houses are plenty far back, and so the risk, even if there is some surface sliding, because they do happen, it's not going to hurt your house. But you always want to be aware, and again, why you want to do all of your due diligence. Some people think medium bank properties are kind of the Goldilocks of properties, if you will. Not too high, not too low, kind of just the best of everything in between. You're high enough up that you still get amazing vistas. You're also high enough up that you don't have a lot of the flood risks that often happen with the lower bank waterfront properties. And then in most cases, you can find ways to get access down to the water, whether it be a staircase or a path. If it's medium bank, it's pretty easy to do. Low bank properties, of course, they're coveted. It's kind of what everybody dreams about. You want to be able to just walk out your door, walk onto your shoreline, hop on your paddle board or kayak, or hop in the boat and go for a ride. They are, in general, going to be the most valuable. They're going to have the highest taxes, by the way. We haven't talked a lot about that, but waterfront taxes are high, and the lower your bank, probably the higher your taxes are going to be. Also, they're going to be the most prone to being in the zones where FEMA flood insurance or other flood insurance is required. But again, awfully nice to have. Along with low bank property, let's talk about beaches and the types of beaches that we have, because not all beaches are created equal. Importantly, if you spent a lot of time on the ocean, you're used to long miles of sandy beaches, and we do not have that here. There are a few very coveted areas of sandy beaches. One of them is Ford Drive along Hale Passage in Gig Harbor. There's a couple of other spots that have sandy beaches, but those are pretty rare in our area. The majority of our beaches are going to be rock. Mostly big rock. They can sometimes be covered with barnacles. Some areas they're not going to be. A lot of times they're slippery. They're not perfect for beach walking, but it's also not bad. It's kind of what you get around here. It's not the kind of beach that you're going to put out your lawn chair and most likely hang out for the day. It's more the type of beach where the dog's going to run around and play and you're going to enjoy the landscape for what it is that you have. Hence why low bank property is coveted, and or if you can get access to your beach from any kind of waterfront property, it's what you want to do. Now, we also have beach that is silt at low tide, and we have beach that's mud. Some of the silt beaches, it's wildlife mecca at low tide, and you can walk on them, and you can fish or dig for shellfish, and you can do all kinds of fun beach combing on the silt beaches. So they can be just as magical as everything else. And the landscape is always changing between low and high tide with all the different wildlife that come in. The mud beaches, well, they are just that. They're literally mud, and you find them often in the protected bays, in the ends of the protected bays. And you can step in and you will sink down to here. You will lose your flip-flops or your shoes. So if you're gonna have a muddy beach, you're just gonna know that you can use that beach mostly when the tide is in, and when the tide's out, probably not very usable. You're gonna have to go somewhere else to access the water. Moving on to number 5, wildlife. Why would wildlife be a consideration for waterfront property that you want to make sure you are aware of, and maybe isn't always everything that it's cracked up to be? Well, once again, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek because the wildlife that you're able to see when you live and breathe on the water is spectacular, especially the birds. We have eagles that soar everywhere, and you can watch them picking up fish right from the water. We have kingfishers, osprey, and heron, all of which are awesome. They do tend to sometimes leave droppings, whether it be of their food that they're leaving behind or, of their personal stuff on your windows, on your docks, on your decks, and you are going to have to clean them more often. We have geese that just straight up leave a mess wherever they go. The best advice I have for you for geese, get a dog. Because geese, when they know a dog lives in a house and is gonna come out in the backyard and chase them away, they will actually migrate away from your property and move on to the next one. But if they stay on your property, look out, because they just make a heck of a mess and they like to hang out. Another one you might not think about because they look so cute most of the time are the otters. Otters are known as really obnoxious marine animals in this area. Reason being, they will crawl into any warm place they can find. One of their favorite places is under boat covers, and they will nestle in your boats and they will just wreak havoc. Unfortunately, really bad havoc on the upholstery, the foam, and the carpet inside your boats. Luckily, most of this can be mitigated by having a really good cover on your boat or other small deterrents, but the otters are something you have to think about. Another fun thing about the wildlife, but also something to consider, are the sea lions and the harbor seals. So they like to congregate on the docks and on swim platforms, and for some reason, they fight for space on the docks. I have no idea why. I don't understand them enough to know why, but they cause a huge ruckus, and they often do it before sunrise. And so you can hear them. They're just out in the water and they're just fighting, and you go look and you can see they're just trying to push one another off the docks. It's really quite funny, but they are loud and kind of chaotic. If you live inland in this area, you are most likely dealing with a very large deer population, and that is not different on the water, I have to tell you. The deer will come onto your property and eat all of your flowers and your plants no matter where you are, so that's just something to be aware of in this part of the world. But something that is so cool is that we do see whales quite frequently in our part of the Puget Sound. You might think, only if you go up to the San Juans or way out in the open Puget Sound. That's not true. We have resident pods of whales that live directly in the Puget Sound that will often make their way all throughout this area, including all the way into Henderson Bay, depending on where the salmon are running. And then there are transient pods of orcas that visit multiple times each summer as well. So there are Facebook groups and organizations throughout the area that will help you track the whales, and they're always amazing if you get to see them. Finally, number 6, it wouldn't be the Pacific Northwest if we were not talking about the weather. And as you can see behind me, we're trying to beat it today. So we're gonna try and wrap this up. As we talked about before, when you live on the water or visit the water, you have a front row seat to everything Mother Nature has to offer, and it is amazing. Probably the biggest consideration when you live on the water, though, compared to if you're inland, is the wind. If you're on a high bank property especially, or if you're on a south-facing property, because our prevailing weather does come from the south, you are going to be a lot more exposed to the wind. So you're going to have to be thinking about what that's going to do to your property. You can't necessarily just leave stuff out on your patios and porches all the time, because it will blow away. That being said, when you talk to people who've spent a lot of time or even have owned an oceanfront property before, they talk about the kind of corrosion and the kind of issues that water spray, and particularly saltwater spray, does to their properties. It's completely different here because we don't have the crazy waves and the crazy surf. We don't have that kind of saltwater splashing up against the houses. I was talking to someone just the other day who was saying at their East Coast property, they have to replace all kinds of things every few years. We just don't have that here. It's just a consideration to keep in mind. If you're very, very down low to the water and you happen to be south facing, you might have some of that happening, but by and large, it's all pretty tame here. It's so cool to be able to watch all the weather from a waterfront property. The skies are so expansive, the stars, if you're not surrounded by the trees. It's just the sunrises, the sunsets, the storms coming and going. It's all absolutely amazing. And so even though I've spent this video telling you about some things about living on the water that aren't always magical, ultimately, even on a day when a storm is coming in like this is still pretty magical. Well, I hope you found some of this information helpful, and I want to thank you for following along with me today. I'm only scratching the surface of everything we're talking about with regard to living on the water, especially when we get into the shoreline permitting, construction, docks, bulkheads, all that good stuff. I'm going to make sure that I add resources in the notes and in the links where you can find the permitting consultants, also some more information from Pierce County and other places. Further, I want to invite you to ask me questions. You can leave those questions in the comments, or you can, text or call me. I would love to do other videos answering your specific questions of how I can be most helpful to you. I want to thank you again for following along. I hope that you will like and subscribe, and if there is anything I can do for you, please give me a call.